welcome to the AFFINITY Podcast. Today we're going to be talking about communication. Hi, Grantley. How are you?
Hi, good. How are you doing?
Good. Where do you want to start?
I think I want to start with just underlining the fact that communication has been at the actual center of human achievement. If you really think about it, human civilization has become what it's become because of the ability to communicate. And those communications are verbal, obviously, so we have language, but also written. And the exchange that happens between people from, the very early, our very first forefathers, has actually been something that's not just verbal and it's not just written either. It goes well beyond that, and it's sort of an energetic exchange between people. And I just want to point out that it is at the center of who we have become as a civilization, or as a, as an entity, if you will, the human race.
Okay, if you could sum up 3 of the top characteristics of effective communication in business, what would those be for you?
Well, obviously, the center is listening to your people. And your people, there's really multiple constituencies. You've got stakeholders, and you've got members, or in the case of other businesses, customers, clients, patients, whatever that is. You've also got your team members, and I probably want to focus a little bit on team members today, just as a whole, because as I speak to in the Affinity formula, a great team experience leads to a great member or customer experience, which equals financial results. So we really need to know how we're communicating with our people, and to have functional communication platforms to do so. But the 3 points, I'd say, obviously, listening, but empathy has to be within that. So empathetic listening. Active listening is probably another way to think about it. When I think of active listening, what I think of is that we're engaged with that person very much in a two-way conversation, so it's a dialogue, but equally, we're not just thinking about what we're going to say next, which often happens, isn't it? We're talking with somebody and we're thinking, okay, how am I going to respond to this? And we're not truly engaged at that active listening level, and I think that's really critical. Communication is always a two-way street. A lot of times, particularly when you're in leadership roles, you might end up monologuing because maybe you think you know best, or maybe you do know best, but the monologue tends to shut people down over time. So it's really important to ask open-ended questions, to engage in a dialogue rather than a monologue. And the other one is, and I think this is going to come up later in the conversation, but just is being really open to maybe negative responses, or even responses that are different to what you would hope or be looking for. And that sounds sort of counterintuitive, but we do suffer from confirmation bias. So what we often do is we're thinking about the outcome we want, and we want that person to agree with us, which is sort of normal human behavior. But often those counterpoints that people bring up, or those contrary opinions that people exhibit, are really powerful and balancing in terms of us having different frameworks to think about, rather than just thinking about, from our viewpoint, how we think the conversation should go or how it should be directed. When people offer up contrary opinions, my ears perk up, because I'm like, okay, should we think about this a little differently? If the hairs on the back of your neck perk up, though, one thing I recommend is just to take a breath, not respond immediately, and if you need time to process it, say let's come back to that tomorrow, or let's come back to that next time, rather than arcing up because they've said something that maybe is confronting to you. So as a leader or manager, or a departmental head, or even a person that just is working with other people, it's really good to remain as open-minded as possible. So that would be sort of, I guess is that 3?
It doesn't matter.
Yeah.
That number doesn't matter. But
Yeah.
what you made me think of a lot is parenting. Just to go on a tiny little tangent here, but I feel like we often don't listen to our kids. And there's really valid reasons for that. Sometimes, they're young and we feel like they're not as knowledgeable and not as experienced, then all we need to do is teach them, and we want to teach them. So it's really well intended, comes from the right place. But I have lately, over the last few years, made it a point to listen to our kids a lot more. And oh my goodness, it's completely shifted my relationship with them. It's shifted my opinion of them. Not that I had a bad one before, but oh my goodness, these kids have so much to teach us. And I think that's across the board, right?
Yep.
It's just another perspective.
Yep.
And we need to be open to other perspectives. So I think that's a really good one.
And young people are coming up through organisations. A lot of times they don't feel they have a voice. One of the things we do with Affinity OS is do the ENPS. So we ask people for their opinion, team members for their opinion on what their experience is like. And often you can see and hear young voices coming through that they've really got something to contribute. It's amazing when they have that open and it's an open forum where they don't feel like they can get into trouble because they don't have to declare who they are. But just the very nature of the comments sometimes, maybe you could describe some of them as naive, but in that naivety is some brilliance and some reflections that you don't have because have had all these experiences over the years that have informed you, but equally they've maybe solidified you into maybe not as thinking about things as flexibly.
I think it's so important to give people a way to express themselves. It doesn't matter what position they're in. It doesn't even matter what job they do, but it's another perspective on your company. And I think that's invaluable. And the more different perspectives you can get too, the better value you get. Like you like to use the GPS analogy. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, so look, a lot of times we form our opinion pretty quickly. Fast-moving companies, I've been involved with a lot of startups, a lot of companies that are really rocketing ahead, and we tend to jump maybe to conclusions, I'd say, would be one way to think about it. When I talk about the GPS, so a GPS, when it's trying to navigate or triangulate is what it does between at least 3 points, gets very accurate the more points that it has. And oftentimes we'll gather one data point. I talk about this in interviewing and hiring. It's critical when hiring to get multiple data points and not from the same area or same level. It's so powerful to have the people that we will be working with that person to be in the interview process, even people that will be working under that person, which often doesn't happen in companies because we kind of forget that their opinion matters. But it really does, because if they're engaged with this person, if they've been a part of the process of hiring them, they feel a level of accountability with regards to their success. So I often say, don't treat it as an interview. Go for a coffee with the team that will be working under that person, and let's just see what feedback we get. And a lot of times in those less, interrogative environments where you're just chatting and hanging out, you get some real insights. So, the data points, multiple data points, very powerful. From a communication platform standpoint, that's, again, why Affinity OS is so powerful. It will not see data as being functional until you get to a significant quantity of feedback. So it does filter out what you'd say would be anecdotal evidence, and that's a powerful mechanism. Yeah,
and the anecdote that comes to mind for me about that is the story of Dr. Ralph Cohen, a very dear friend of ours who unfortunately is no longer with us. But Ralph, at the end of his life, his last project was to develop interdisciplinary communication mechanisms. That's what he came to after spending 70 years in academia. Tell us a little about Ralph, because I think he's really relevant here.
Yeah, so Ralph was one of the foremost English literature professors in the world. He was the editor of the foremost English literature journal. Yep. And Ralph was a phenom. So he's still working in his 90s, right? And the faculty that he set up, he wanted to set up at one university and they weren't open to it. So another university actually approached him to do it. And he set up a faculty there that was interdisciplinary, as you described. So engineers were talking to the English or literature department, were talking to the history department. But when they came together, the confluence of what they knew gave them new perspectives on what they were doing and what each other, could benefit from. So it was a huge landmark movement that Ralph sort of started, and I see that happening more and more across, certainly the education realm. I think it's a new form of education, is rather than put people in holes or in silos, it's that Venn diagram I talk about, get those intersections going. Yeah.
Excellent. Can you talk a little bit about feedback systems and the importance of feedback systems in the overall communication platforms?
Yeah. So when you're in a small business, you usually have your finger on the pulse. You're there a lot of hours. You see you in the early morning, the late night, and all that sort of stuff. As businesses get bigger and they get more executive functions in there, we tend to get removed from direct feedback. And it's really hard to quantify that or to make that work in a functional way when you've got, in the case of, I'll talk about, health clubs or fitness centres, hundreds of sites with thousands of team members and hundreds of thousands of members. What I'll say is, at that point, using, the analog system, which I'll talk a little bit more about later, is really difficult. Sure, you want to get into those clubs and shake hands and chat with people and get those analog exchanges, but you really need to move into the digital world. And now with the advent of AI, you've got powerful ways to distill that feedback. So a feedback system like Affinity OS is really powerful because it is a distillation of all that information. And you can also look at it across sites. So you can look at best practices and see where some sites are flourishing or they have certain aspects that they're very good at. And you can use those as a space to focus other clubs or other facilities or other businesses around what they might do better.
Can you add on to that the aspect of feedback from and to team members?
Yeah, so feedback systems, again, need to be a two-way street. They can't be a one-way. It can't be a monologue. And so when a team member gives feedback through Affinity OS, for example, there's an opportunity for the executive, whoever's reviewing those members' comments or team member comments, to respond. And that's really critical, and the response is critical. What I find, though, if you look at the system, it allows people to opt in or opt out, so they can be acknowledged as an individual, right? So they can be known, if you will, and it also allows them to remain anonymous. And we need to do that to get real transparency. But when somebody does let you know who they are, they're obviously seeking you to respond, and so it's really important to respond. But the other group, that anonymous group that are giving you feedback, a lot of times that feedback bubbles to the top into these big elements that really need to be addressed. And so I think it's really critical then to have a feedback system, like let's call it a regular email or a regular newsletter to your team, but just a regular exchange to the team where you acknowledge those comments, those questions, those concerns on a global level. So no one feels like, oh, okay, they must have worked out who I am. It comes back to them through that mechanism. But that's, again, a powerful sort of closing the loop system. And it's all about closing those loops, those communication loops.
It's so true, because wouldn't the number one or one of the top complaints of teams be that their executive team or their leadership team isn't communicating with them enough? I hear that all the time.
Absolutely. And particularly as companies grow bigger, they become more separated. Like this week, I've been out traveling around the businesses that I'm involved with as a CEO, and it's amazing when you get on site, how much that means to the team, but equally you do learn other things and you get more texture. As much as I think Affinity OS is a critical, system, if you will, to have for that communication and to understand what's going across a group, you still need to put some boots on the ground as well.
Can you talk about reviews? Because that's also communication. So team member reviews, how do you approach that, and what are your key elements of a review system?
Yeah, it's a great question. So again, a review is a communication opportunity. A lot of times we treat it as ticking a box. We've done the annual review, we've done the 6-monthly review, And we ask people, we don't ask people what they think of how they're doing. We tend to tell them how we think they're doing. So one of the tools I've used a lot is to set up position descriptions with a review system built in. What I mean by that is when we hand somebody a position description, this is what we're asking them to do as a job. So doesn't it make sense to review them on the basis of that? But equally, how do they think they're doing? So I ask the team member to review themselves, so give themselves a score. I use a 0 to 5 system. And then I equally will fill out and I'll give them my scores. And let's talk about communication. Let's say we ask them how they feel like their communication is and they give themselves a 5 and I give them a 2 because I have concerns about that. What a great conversation point that they think they're communicating really well. I don't think they are. Let's talk about that. And maybe my paradigm will shift, or maybe they might shift a little, but it does bring awareness to the conversation. More often what I find is team members actually are more critical of themselves than I am. So a team member will, for example, in their KPIs, say, I just don't think I'm getting to my numbers. And when I look at everything in the context of what is happening in that company or in that unit, business unit, it's really powerful for me to be able to reflect on that and go, actually, I think you're doing really well under the circumstances, and given the competition or given this, exactly what they're dealing with, I can actually, dispel some of their concerns and some of their own sort of beating themselves up. So feedback systems like that, review systems, can be powerful, but they have to be two-way.
Can you talk a little bit about tough conversations? I know that's something that a lot of leaders struggle with. I know you've definitely noticed that through the years. Now I know that you are someone that really actually revels in having tough conversations. Can you tell us a little about that?
Yeah, look, yeah.
Revel not in the...
Yeah,
not in
no.
the
Well, sometimes...
That did not come out right.
Yeah. It's an opportunity.
Yeah.
To give, honest feedback, transparent feedback that maybe often won't be received well initially. It is critical. It's just critical to have the tough conversations. And what I try and do is wrap it up in a more contextual conversation. So rather than just coming in and hammering on somebody for something they've done wrong or being very critical, I try and look at where things are going well, what things they're doing that are working for them and working for us, and then obviously reflect on the things that I think they need to work on. But a lot of times these conversations hang over our head as leaders, where we avoid them, and it creates this rift and almost a communication gap with the team member, where we're avoiding talking to them because we're frustrated, for example, and we don't have the tough conversation. Why I do revel in the conversations is once it's had, everybody sighs, has a sigh of relief, particularly the team members, because regardless of whether we think they know or not, oftentimes they are aware of what's going on and they're feeling guilty maybe for their actions, or a lot of times I find people have conflicting challenges, like it might be a mum who's got a little one at home and she's feeling guilty coming to work, so she's getting out of there as quick as possible. Maybe she's not doing the job as well as she might normally because she's stressed around that, but then she feels guilty for going home. That's really tough. So I think having those conversations, bringing this stuff to light, talking about solutions is a really good thing. In terms of letting people go, which is probably one of the toughest conversations, I feel like and particularly the organisation I'm in now and most of the organisations I've been involved with where I've had a degree of control over decisions like that, I feel like we make really good decisions around that, and that it's often and designed to be in the best interest of the individual as well. That if they're not a good fit and there's not a good fit in the organisation for them, that doesn't make them a bad person or incapable of being functional in an organisation, just that they're not a good fit. And demonstrating that and even looking for solutions with them is often a very powerful tool to do. So, when we do have these tough conversations, it's incredibly important to be, yes, empathetic, but equally to think about the outcome that you want and what I want to be very transparent is my motivation, and hopefully what the motivation underlying that is the best interest of them as well as the company.
Can you tell us a little about your philosophy of seeking to understand? I know that's a really big one for you. You always say first seek to understand, then be understood. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, so Stephen Covey spoke to, first seek to understand, then to be understood. I love that. I think that's a really powerful tool. Again, when people come back with a contrary opinion, I want to know more. I'm typically going to ask more questions and have a reaction to that initially. I think if you can understand where someone's coming from, understand their motivation, understand how they are or how they've come to that conclusion, those are powerful things. And a lot of times that maybe that initial reaction you have actually dissipates a lot when you really understand where it's coming from. So seeking to understand is critical, and that means asking a lot of questions, listening a lot. One thing I'd say is a lot of times with certain personalities, particularly an introvert, they're going to need space to process or time to process. Doesn't mean they're less intelligent or they're slower. It's just how they work. And so I feel like you've got to give people space. So if you know the team member well, you know that they typically need time to process. A lot of times what I'll do, I'll drop a seed and I'll leave. So I'll plant a seed of a question that they can ponder on, and then I'll follow up with them at a later date or a later time. And that gives them time to process in isolation if that's what they need. But you get better answers that way rather than putting people on the spot. Not everybody's going to have an answer on the spot. Like I tend to have a very quick response time.
Too quick sometimes, if I may say so myself.
I was just going to say, and sometimes...
I did not mean that in a bad way.
No, sometimes to my detriment, where I would be better at least looking to process it a little bit more rather than I think this or that.
I'm reflecting on your wittiness, not on your impulsiveness. That's not what I'm saying, but yeah.
No, but I oftentimes think I should take a little bit more time with some of these things. But I do feel like for those people that are need more time to process, giving them space is a powerful, powerful tool to really perk to the top their gifts.
This really speaks to getting to know the people that you're working with, because you're saying you have to understand who you're speaking to. Are they an introvert? Are they an extrovert? Do they have certain fears that you get to know over time and patterns that they display? And as a mindful leader, if you get to know that person, you know how to approach a conversation. So like you said, if you're talking to an introvert, give them time to process. Can you talk a little bit about the importance of creating relationships with your people as a mindful leader?
Yeah, well, look, a business is a community, right? So, and there's, the old adage, it takes a village, it takes all sorts of people. And the better you know your people, the better you're able to help them craft their position and their, the best place that they can position themselves. And I'll give you an example. There's a person we hired 4 or 5 months ago. That person's been struggling in their position. We thought they'd be a good fit, but for a variety of reasons, they weren't really well suited to it. So we missed some things. We misinterpreted some things. And so we've got to take responsibility for that. That's not just simply on them. I don't think that person misrepresented themselves. But at the end of the day, we need to correct that. And there's a thing I talk about in the affinity principle, job crafting. And I feel like a lot of times we can change, like maybe just a little bit sometimes, a person's role and make them much happier and put them in flow and in turn get better productivity out of that person. So understanding that person's critical. You can never get to know somebody in an interview, right? You're going to see a little tidbit of them. And in that particular case of that person, what they were telling us about what they did in their spare time suggested they were more gregarious, more outgoing, more, front-facing than they really were. They were a massive introvert. And I interpreted their shyness in the interview as being part of the interview process. So it's really good to get to know people is my point. And that comes back to another thing. So, one of the things that Affinity OS is a referral and retention system. And it's not just a referral and retention system for membership. It's a referral and retention system for team members. And my point being related to this, when we get a referral from a team member, that's hugely valuable. Because if a team member loves the company enough to refer a friend or even a family member to the company, they're referring somebody that they think will be a good fit, probably somebody they've known over a period of years. They've seen them on their best day and their worst day, and that's really powerful. So where I'm going with this is that referrals from team members to proffer team members to you is a really, really good first sort of base to get to in the interview process, because you're getting where I said you can't get to know that person in the interview process. That team member does know them and is referring them for a reason, and as a function of that, you're getting a real head start on that interview process, if you will.
Can you talk about meetings? I know there's a shocking and yet at the same time not so shocking numbers. Something like billions of dollars are wasted every year in inefficient meeting times. Can you talk about meetings and structures and best practices?
Yeah, so meetings to me, they're essential. You need to get the team together, and that might be a departmental get-together or a head of department get-together or an executive get-together. I think we need to really be efficient with those meetings, and a lot of times I've sat through 2 and 3 hour meetings and it's just brutal, and by the end, it's really hard to maintain focus and see value from that experience. And if you think about it, so let's say you got your executive team together and you meet for an hour, you could have thousands of dollars worth of salary sitting in that room. Whereas I've talked about the stand-up in the past. The stand-up's that 60-second, I'm going to call it a vignette that a person gives of what's happened prior to the last meeting, what's happened, what's your plan for from here through to the next meeting, and any rocks they have in the shoes. Very short little elements like that are going to help you get context of what's going on without bogging down in these brutal meeting cycles. So I think regular meetings are necessary. I think they should be short and sharp. I think we should be thoughtful about how we approach them. They need to be, in generally, reflective and prospective. And I think it needs to be a forum for people to express themselves, but in a way that's productive and I'm going to say time sensitive to the fact that everybody's really busy.
Can you talk about open door policy and where that fits in to communication?
Yeah, so I've joined companies that typically the execs or the senior team would close their doors, and because they want privacy, they're on calls, and they feel like they work better when they're behind their closed doors. I've insisted on open door policy, with the exception of when there is a sensitive conversation happening between them and a team member or them and a phone call. But the key with the open door policy is really symbolic. It's saying, look, I'm available, I'm accessible. If you need to talk, I'm here. And the difference that you feel energetically in a company, not to sound all woo-woo, but the difference you do feel that's very tangible when you have an open door policy market. I also think open door policy is more figurative as well, not just literal, where people have access to you. And I know that's hard when you move further up and you've got more team members, but ultimately if you've got a very open platform where people can give you feedback, and again, Affinity OS is a great tool for that, because it gives people access to you, to the leadership, through a regular and rhythmic acquisition of their thoughts. So that's part of an open door policy, something like a Affinity OS EMPS system.
Digital versus analog. You talk about this a lot. Can you talk about that in this context?
Yeah, so I mentioned it earlier. These days, a lot of people work from home, and they Zoom in or they jump on a video conference call, and that works very well when you've got people all across the country or all across the globe potentially, but it's not anywhere near the same as being in the same room as those people. So I'd say two aspects of this. Firstly, I think wherever possible, we should have human contact. We should be meeting with people in a real sense. But equally, one of the problems we're seeing in the workplace and seeing across the board is a lot of depression, a lot of sense of isolation, a lot of people feeling anxious and isolated. And I feel like working from home does that. Jana, you've experienced that firsthand, working long stints at home without human interaction. So it's debilitating. And so I feel like we need to get analog at least a couple of times a week. So as much as your biggest introvert will say they want to work from home, they love it because they can work in isolation, they still need to be around people. And we all do. We all need to be around people. If you look at the Blue Zone's premise, the foundation of the Blue Zones is community, and it is connection, and it's human connection. It's not digital connection. So as much as a lot of us may have a big digital community, in truth, the value of your, and I'm going to call it again, the analog community is probably exponential, even though it might be much smaller in content and interactions. It's going to be much more powerful, that analog experience that you have when you go out with friends for drinks, or you go meet with somebody for a coffee, or you sit with the team member to chat about where they're at. Doing that on a Zoom call can be very constructive. Doing it in person, it's just a whole nother level.
Well, this topic, I think we could go on for hours, right? But do you have any closing thoughts?
One thing I would say is I do think communication should be rhythmic. And what I mean by that, they should cycle on a rhythmic basis, so there's constant touch points. Again, Affinity OS does that in the EMPS system monthly with team members. Every month we get a data point from the team members, which is really good for taking the pulse. With members, with Affinity OS, we get a quarterly check-in. Not as often, but we're also taking a big sample, so we're also getting feedback that compiles. I'm also talking from an analog perspective, meeting with team regularly. So, for example, I would get out to the business locations for the company I work with. I try to get out there once a month, and that should be the minimum really for me to do that, just to make those rhythmic contact points. And I know it makes a difference. And I see how it makes a difference when we have these check-ins. And sometimes we were talking about this in the car earlier, just having a coffee with somebody or having lunch with them can be just huge. And maybe you're not talking about work. Maybe just talking about, where they're at. And that in and of itself is powerful. It's about building relationships, and relationships are built through regular rhythmic contact, really.
Very true. I think sometimes people are drowning and they're so busy that they don't even realize they're drowning. And so that touch point with someone who's actually going to sit and listen and go, holy moly, you're really having a hard time. Like, that's really hard to hear. Even that can have tremendous impact on somebody's life.
Yeah, and their wellness.
Yep,
absolutely.
Anything else?
No, that's great.
Awesome. Well, thank you for joining us today. We hope you enjoyed it. If you have any comments or questions, you can reach out to us on social or leave a comment. And we hope you can join us next time.